And you see you there. Do you struggle with workout performance or energy throughout the day? In this video, we're going to break down carbohydrates, how you can use them throughout the day as part of a bigger diet, and how you can use them as a part of a pre-workout or post-workout nutrition. So carbohydrates can largely be broken down into two specific categories. Simple carbohydrates, which are made up of one or two sugars, and complex carbohydrates, which is usually three or more. A common simple sugar you may have heard of is glucose. Glucose is free-flowing throughout your body and stored in various places of the body by different names. This is what most people mean when they talk about blood sugar, and this is a thing that needs to be very heavily regulated so that you don't die either from low blood sugar or high blood sugar. A side note of this is that your brain absolutely loves glucose, and don't let carnivore people tell you otherwise. A very common complex carbohydrate that is very, very good for health is fiber. There's two subcategories of fiber. The first being soluble, which your body can break down to a small degree, and only has 2 calories per gram, whereas a normal carbohydrate has 4. The second category, being insoluble, gives you 0 calories, no energy, because your body physically can't break it down, and it helps to kind of flush out the digestive tract. It helps with many other things such as cholesterol, blood pressure, etc. Fiber in terms of your diet is very, very beneficial because it affects gastric emptying rates, which means it can help keep you fuller for longer or slow the digestion of your meals. Glucose, when it becomes stored, likely in the muscle, is stored in the form of glycogen. You've probably heard the term muscle glycogen. It can also be stored throughout the body, mainly in the liver. The vast majority of the storage of glycogen in the body is in muscle tissue. Think of when endurance athletes specifically like preload carbohydrates before their activities. This is what that is. We dived a little bit deeper into glucose. Now let's dive a little bit deeper into fiber. There are many benefits of fiber, and most people should be meeting the RDA for health. It is very, very crucial. Some of the benefits include reduced risk of cardiovascular disease, reduced total body inflammation, reduced blood pressure, better regulation of blood sugar, gastric health, reduced risk of certain types of cancer, and in terms of body weight, it improves overall satiety. If you haven't maxed out your fiber intake and you're dieting, you should consider doing so. Fiber is basically cheat codes for life. We've outlined two very common and useful types of carbohydrates. Now let's talk about how they get digested and metabolized. Digestion of carbs happens like many other things in the body. It starts with chewing, and then eventually the food gets passed to the stomach. But interestingly enough, the acidity of your stomach prevents most of the carbohydrate from being digested and utilized there, comparatively with other foods. One of the key reasons for this is because salivary amylase, enzyme from your mouth, gets broken down and destroyed in the stomach, and that's required to break down carbohydrate and use it. Most of the benefit and the absorption you're actually going to get from carbohydrate actually occurs in the small intestine because of this. So all this talk about carbohydrate is great and all, but what actually happens when we take it in, how does it get used, etc. Ideally, especially if your exercise intensity is quite high, carbohydrate gets used for fuel for exercise. If it's not used for fuel for exercise and you're looking more on the recovery side of the coin, it can be storage form, as muscle glycogen. If your calories are well above what your maintenance calories are and you're going to be storing actual energy, glycogen and glucose can actually get converted to fatty acids and stored as body fat. This talk on carbohydrate doesn't negate the fact that in terms of body weight, calories are still king. And I will fight you on that. Whether your body's needing to store glucose or make it ready to be burned for exercise, there's various hormones that go into this equation. If you have too much going around or you're specifically trying to recover and store glucose as glycogen, insulin is going to be the primary hormone responsible for this. Inversely, if you started exercising and you need to mobilize glycogen as a form of glucose, glucagon is going to be the hormone that does this. On either side of this equation, if it's not tightly regulated, you can have very deleterious effects, being hypoglycemia, diabetes, etc. This regulation of blood glucose is very tightly controlled in healthy populations. One of the ways you can influence this is via the glycemic index. The glycemic index is a rating scale that measures how much your blood glucose level will change via 50 grams of carbohydrate of a specific food. If you have a high glycemic index, that food is going to aggressively affect your blood glucose level. Think like a Mountain Dew. Conversely, foods with a low glycemic index take a lot longer to exert their effect on your blood glucose level. Think like fiber as a great example. We talked about how slowly that gets digested. Nested within that is a term called glycemic load. Glycemic load is essentially the glycemic index of the food multiplied by how much of that carbohydrate you take in. So if I were to take one sip of a high glycemic food like Mountain Dew, though it should affect my blood glucose meaningfully, haven't ingested enough carbohydrate to actually do that. So that's where glycemic load comes in, and it's dictated by how much carbs I actually take in. So in example A, I just take one sip, my blood sugar is not going to change that much. Example B, like undergraduate Zach, I drink 5 Mountain Dews in a row. That is going to be a much different glycemic load. So we've already touched on it a little bit, but just to reiterate and just to make carnivore people even more mad, glycogen and glucose are going to be the preferred method of energy for exercise. The higher intensity of that exercise, the more reliance you're going to have on carbohydrate. So you sitting in your chair just listening to this lecture are likely not going to need much carbohydrate to kind of maintain your regulatory functions. Oftentimes it can be done by fat. If you were to be chased around by me with a baseball bat sprinting, then you would start to need carbohydrates. So as exercise intensity ramps up, the need for carbohydrate ramps up. Going back to our example where I'm chasing you and you're running for your life, there are 3 ways that this exercise is going to eventually fatigue you. First is going to be the muscle can no longer produce adequate force. This could be because of damage or many other factors. Or you're just a teeny tiny little weakling. The second is going to be that your ATP demands move from the phosphocreatine system and move into the glycolytic system. This is what's going to happen when your body can't supply adequate oxygen, and eventually glycolysis as a byproduct is going to give off hydrogen ions, making your blood more acidic. This is that burn you feel during lifting. Side note there, lactic acid is not actually the thing that makes your muscles burn when you're lifting. It's hydrogen ions making your blood more acidic. When the blood is too acidic, actin and myosin physically can't bind to each other, and your muscle is prevented from contracting. And the third reason why you might fatigue in exercise, more relevant to this conversation, is going to be energy depletion. If you run out of glucose and glycogen, specifically in the target muscle or in the area, you're no longer able to actually cause actin and myosin to bind because that requires energy, and you can't cause skeletal muscle contraction. Your body will never actually let you fully run out of glucose and glycogen because it knows you would die. So it will stop you well before that. Okay, so for some carbohydrate recommendations. If you're an athlete, carbohydrates should make up around 55 to 65% of your diet. If you want to be a little bit more technical, somewhere between 5 to 8 grams per kilogram of body weight. I generally prefer to transfer things to freedom units, but I won't do so here. The reason for this high amount of carbohydrate is because, again, exercise, especially higher intensity or prolonged exercise, needs carbohydrates as fuel. So athletes specifically in team sports or endurance sports are going to need to be at the higher end of this range and maybe even go above it. Carbohydrates should be a part of your pre-workout meal, being at least 2 hours prior to your exercise, especially if it's endurance or team sport. And if your activities last longer than 90 minutes, you should consider having it as a part of your intra-workout. If it's shorter than 90 minutes, oftentimes evidence doesn't show that you get much of a benefit from carbohydrates. With one notable exception, carbohydrate mouth rinse, weirdly enough, actually improves strength-based performance as well as endurance-based performance. So subjects would literally put carbohydrate fluid into their mouth and spit it out, and they would actually get a little bit stronger. We don't exactly know why that would occur, but ingesting those carbohydrates for strength athletes wouldn't show the same meaningful benefit. We need more science on that one. Lastly, it's going to promote recovery and muscle protein synthesis after your sport or after your lifting. So 2 hours prior and or 2 hours after, you're going to want to be taking in some amount of carbohydrates. And then if you're a team or endurance athlete, intra-workout is also going to be important. If your training volume is excessively high or you're a very competitive athlete, this recommendation for carbohydrate could go all the way up to 8 to 12 grams per kilogram of body weight, which is a lot of carbohydrates. Hopefully you're eating bread while listening to this. If you are a repeated bout athlete and you need glycogen repletion fast, meaning you need to fill your muscles back up with glucose, there's a few things you can do. You should be taking in 1.2 grams per kilogram per hour of carbohydrate. These carbs should be made of high glycemic carbs, so like sports drinks might be beneficial here. This is going to make a lot of you happy, but you also should consider taking in caffeine, being 3 to 8 milligrams per kilogram of body weight. You also should consider protein during this time, being 0.2 to 0.4 grams per kilogram. Shakes oftentimes make a really optimal option for this. Carbohydrates, a little bit of protein, you're good to go. If your activities are lasting longer than 60 minutes and they're at a relatively high VO2 max, being 70% of your VO2 max, you should do a few unique things. You should likely be taking in 30 to 60 grams per hour of activity of carbohydrate. This should be broken down to roughly a 6 to 8% solution in your water, meaning you should have a large degree of water and 6 to 8% of that should be carbohydrates, etc. What you don't want is a fully loaded carbohydrate sugary drink because that actually kind of can affect how you get hydrated. For whatever reason, you can't get carbohydrates during this time, protein can potentially have a little bit of a helpful effect, but it's not going to be the same. For all my resistance training athletes out there, it's a good idea to take in carbohydrates at least 2 hours prior to your resistance training and probably within 2 hours after. This is going to improve your performance and improve your muscle protein synthesis because we're trying to move the most amount of weight possible, get a lot of active tension, and we're also trying to increase muscle protein synthesis and actually grow that muscle. One big key takeaway on this whole discussion of carbohydrates, and this may also offend a lot of people, protein is still king for athletes, even endurance athletes. So we cannot include carbohydrates at the expense of protein because of muscle wasting, especially in sports that are endurance and or catabolic. So still have that relevant, at least a minimum representation of protein in your diet, and then we can start having a conversation about carbohydrate. If you're an endurance athlete and you watch this video, please consider coming to the dark side and lifting weights. We have a lot of fun over here, and there's pizza.